Hello and welcome to today's tutorial on the SoftLayer API. My name is Christopher Gallo. I'm the Senior API Developer, and I'm responsible for maintaining all of our documentation about the SoftLayer API, along with our open source libraries for interacting with the SoftLayer API. And today we're going to talk about how it works and what to do when it doesn't. So first, we have the anatomy of an API call, and this is going to break down the different parts of what an API call is and where you get this sort of information. And the first basic part is the URL. There's a public and private endpoint, and the only difference between these two is the private endpoint has a SoftLayer resource metadata service, and the private endpoint is only available on the SoftLayer private network. This means you can only access it through either a VPN connection or a resource on the private network itself, like a virtual machine or a hardware server. Once we have the endpoint, we need to specify the type of API request we're going to make and the version of that API request we're going to use. So there's three main types. REST, which will have your familiar REST syntax, although there's a few idiosyncrasies in the SoftLayer API that make it not entirely RESTful, just REST-like. Then there's SOAP, which is going to require you to send in a fully formed SOAP request. And an XML RPC, which is very similar to SOAP, except it's not as strictly typed as SOAP request is. All three of those will have access to the same services, methods, data types, and all of that. The only difference between these three is the format in which you send data into the API and the format the API sends back to you. Aside from that, they all have access to the same data. Now, there's two different versions that we can use, version 3 and version 3.1. Version 3.1 is different in that it includes the SoftLayer search service and some object mask performance improvements that, while not obvious to an end user, on some object mask requests that you send in, changing the version can drastically improve your performance. So when picking a version to use, almost always use 3.1. So the API is broken down into services, which contain a collection of methods that perform some action. And with a REST request like this, you just put the SoftLayer service that you want to use at the end of the URL. And that tells the API you're going to use this service to perform an action that we'll get to in a moment. And data returned by the API is going to be broken down into what we call data types. Services are usually going to have a matching data type, but not all data types will have a matching service. And you can figure all this out through our documentation right here. And here is an example of the SoftLayer account service. This is the public documentation for it. Here we have where it's the service itself. You can click on service, or the green box will take you to the data type page, which shows you all the properties for the service, a brief description telling you what the service does, and a list of all the methods that are available to you to call on this specific API. And so once you go through the documentation and find the method that you want to use, for REST requests, you add it to the end of the URL, just like this. So we do SoftLayer service /method, which is pretty normal. So here's an example of the SoftLayer account get object method. So here we're just going to do a simple curl request. We do -s to suppress curl's verbose output. We specify the API user and API key we're going to use. We have our endpoint, our type, our version, our service, and our method. And here, after we call that, we get a JSON object back with all the information about our SoftLayer account. And so for XML and SOAP requests, the method is not going to go in the URL itself. It's going to go in the payload you send into the API. And I'll go over into that in just a moment. Some methods are going to require an init parameter, and that's going to be listed in the documentation as a required header. So you'll see in the documentation for a method that a specific method will require a SoftLayer virtual guest init parameter. And that's going to tell you that to make this API call request, you need to send in a SoftLayer virtual guest ID. And for REST requests to do that, you do that between the service and the methods right here. So for example, if we were to call SoftLayer virtual guest get object, again, we have our curl request set up. We do SoftLayer virtual guest, the ID of the virtual guest we want to get, and then just get object. And then that'll return information about our virtual guest. If, when you're calling one of these methods, you get a 404 error, that can mean a couple of different things. Either you didn't specify a valid ID, the virtual guest you wanted to access, you don't have access to, so you might not have permission to it, you might not be getting access to it, it might be on a different account or something like that. And all of those situations can result in the 404 error. So just when you get that 404, just double check the ID you're sending in to make sure it's valid. So here's an example of the SoftLayer virtual guest edit object documentation. Here we take in one parameter, it's going to be a template object. And a thing to note about parameters is when you send them into the API, especially with REST requests, you do not name them in your data you send into the API. Okay? So we're going to send in a object, a SoftLayer virtual guest object. This method requires we authenticate, and it requires a SoftLayer virtual guest init parameter. So this is the ID that we're going to edit. And so here, an example REST request of that is we have our curl set up again, but this time we need to post the data. So that's what the -x post is. We need to specify as parameters this JSON object. It's going to start by opening up the object. We have a keyword parameters, which is required for every time you send in parameters to a request. We have an array of parameters that we're going to send in. And this array, the order of this array is going to match the order in the documentation. So here we only have one parameter to send in, but if we had 2 or 3, the second and third would be the second and third entries in the array. So the first entry in this array is the first parameter. It is a object of type virtual guest. And when you send in these objects, especially for edit object or anything else, you generally only need to send in the parameters that you want changed. So here we only want to change the host name. So we specify host name and the host name we want to change it to. We send it to the virtual guest service. We specify the ID of our virtual guest, edit object. And once that's done, we'll get a return back. And we know that our virtual guest has been edited. And the return is listed here. It's going to be Boolean. So basically true or false. In the API, when you see return value Boolean, it's almost always going to be true, or you'll get an exception. So you'll almost never get false. If something went wrong, you'll get an exception about it, not a 0 return code. And the last bit of the URL is you can control the format the data is returned by adding the .format at the end. And there's 3 main formats for your REST requests. You got JSON, which is the default. You can specify a text format or an XML format. And for SOAP and XML RPC requests, the data you get back from those is either going to be SOAP or it's going to be just XML. And you can't change those. So for authentication, there's a couple different ways you can authenticate to the API. And I've got a long article about it here on the SLDN website, detailing all the different ways of authenticating, how to get the keys, where they come from, and that sort of thing. But the basics are you have a classic API key. You can tell it's a classic API key because it's going to be 64 characters long and it's associated directly with your SoftLayer user. A cloud.ibm API key, it's going to be shorter, 32 characters, and that's associated with your IBM ID account. And then you can have a token from a user and password. So you take your SoftLayer user, your SoftLayer password, and you can authenticate to the API that way. If you have an IBM ID account, that's not available to you, unfortunately. But you do have a bearer token that you can get with your IBM ID. The IBM Cloud API service has a IAM service, and you authenticate to that. That'll give you a bearer token, and you can use the bearer token to authenticate and make API requests. And all of that is detailed fully in the Authenticating the Software API article that you should read if you don't understand all of that. One special service I want to talk about is the metadata service. As I mentioned earlier, it's only available on the SoftLayer private API endpoint. And you don't need to authenticate to this one because it figures out the authentication based on where the request is coming from. And this service is special in that it will tell you information about the virtual guest or server making the request. So it can provide basic information like get user metadata. So when you order the service, when you ordered the server, you can specify metadata to be associated with it. And this metadata is good for post-provisioning scripts. It'll have whatever information you set it up, and the script will pull that down and initialize the server for you, essentially. You can also do get tag, get hostname, data center, and that sort of thing. So if you're ever trying to automatically provision a server when it boots up, the resource metadata service is something you're definitely going to want to look at. So a quick overview of some common API errors. The first one, authentication headers not found. Just make sure you put in your authentication headers right, in the right format, in the right area. So the 404 error, which I mentioned earlier, just make sure your API user has access to the resource that you're requesting. And make sure the resource exists and has not been canceled. SoftLayer exception public or internal error. This can have a wide variety of causes and it can be often difficult to pin down. But one of the main ones is that you might be requesting too much data from your API request. And so a good solution to that is removing some items from your object mask or not using object mask at all for the API request and see if that still works. You can also use a result limit to restrict how many results you get back in a single query. And oftentimes something other unexpected might have happened. So there might be some other error internally that prevented your API request from working. And a lot of times you'll see this if you're trying to maybe reboot a virtual guest or power it off or something like that. A single virtual guest might throw a 500 internal error if it's unable to reboot itself, which will usually need you to put in a ticket about it, while other virtual guests will work just fine. So that's one thing you can also try to check when you're getting this error is this error only for one specific resource that I'm accessing, or is it for all the resources that I'm accessing? And the last one is the web service bad request. This means the API couldn't parse what you sent in. So either your parameters had some weird characters in it, your object mask or object filters had some weird characters in it. The API transport layer couldn't parse it and couldn't handle your request. And so you just get this bad request error. For this one, just make sure everything you sent in is properly formed, properly URL encoded. You've got all your matching brackets all over the place. And once you do that, that usually fixes most errors. So here's a quick XML example. We're going to use curl again. We're going to send in some post data, and we're going to specify this file, the SoftLayer account get object XML file. And then we're going to send that data to the SoftLayer API. We're going to say XML RPC endpoint v3.1 and the SoftLayer account service. So here are the contents of that file that we're sending in. This top line is not included in the file. It's just telling you that it's this file. So here's where the file starts. We specify method call, the method name that we're calling, get object, the parameters that we're going to send in. So we have some header parameters. The first one, authenticate. We specify a username, API key. And then another header we have is the object mask. We specify mask, and then the mask string format. And once we send that data into the API will parse it and send us back some results, which will look something like this. So a SOAP example, it's very similar to XML. We're going to specify the file that we're going to send in, the URL, very similar to the XML example, except instead of XML for the endpoint, we got SOAP. So here's what our SOAP object will look like. We open it up here. We got our SOAP envelope. We got our schemas, namespaces. On the header, we have authenticate, username, API key, object mask. There's our object mask. And to specify the method, we have our body, and we just have here get object. And that tells the API we're going to call SoftLayer account get object here. And a response, here it is again, a SOAP response, a lot of data here. And here's a REST example. So your basic template is going to look something like this. Always start out with username and password. If needed, you've got your parameters that you need to sit in. Like I mentioned earlier, this parameters keyword is required. We have our array of parameters, the first parameter and the second parameter. If you don't have any parameters, just leave this out. Then we've got our URL, REST endpoint, 3.1, service name, init parameters. If you don't have any, leave it out. Method name. And then for the required headers part, we use URL parameters for these rather than post parameters for the API parameters. I know that can be a little confusing, but hopefully this template kind of helps figure that out for you. So the URL parameters are object mask, object filter, and result limit. So a real example with SoftLayer account, get object. We specify our object mask, which we have to URL encode, and then we get our results back. So here's an example of a simple API call with the CLI tools. Because making REST requests and XML RPC requests by hand can be pretty tedious, the SLCLI provides a call API method to help out here. This is available on our GitHub, which is github.com, SoftLayer, SoftLayer Python. And to use it, you just do SLCLI, say call API, the service you want to use, the method of that service, the mask, and any other parameters that you want get specified here. And you get a result back in a nice, pretty table. The IBM Cloud Sl tool also has a call API method that is pretty similar to the SLCLI. A few little differences here and there, mostly in the option names that you specify. The IBM Cloud CLI tool is available at this URL. You can download it, and it includes a wide variety of other features that are useful for managing your IBM's cloud account. But for call API, you just do IBM Cloud, SL, call API, account, get object, specify your mask, and you get your result back. So a few API gotchas. Sending in method parameters requires the following format for REST examples. I've mentioned this a couple of times already, but I'm mentioning it again because it is quite often messed up when new users are testing out the API because it doesn't quite make a lot of sense and it's not intuitive. You start off by sending in a single object, right? This whole thing is just one object. The first property of that object is called parameters, which is an array of the parameters you want to send in. And these parameters are usually a special type. So this first parameter is just a string type. We say first. The second parameter is an object. That object might have a sub-object and so on and so forth. Parameters are also not named in the request. They go in the order they are listed on SLDN. On SLDN, each parameter will have a name just to kind of let you know what its purpose is, but you don't put that name in the request when you send it into the API. XML RPC returns integers as signed 32-bit numbers. So some large numbers might have integer overflows, and this is especially problematic with storage devices. So if you have large storage devices and you're looking at bytes used or something else like that, and you're seeing negative numbers in your XML RPC response, that's because XML RPC returns numbers as signed 32-bit. The only option to get around that is to either use the REST API or the SOAP API. Adding a local property to an object mask removes all the default properties, which is usually a good thing and something you want to try to use on purpose because the API responses can be quite large with a lot of data that you don't normally need. It's very easy to request too much data from the API. So anytime your API request is taking more than a few seconds, definitely look at the request that you're making to see if you can trim it down and remove any unneeded properties from your object mask to help that request perform a lot faster. And lastly, it's better to make a lot of small API requests than one large request. So don't feel like making frequent requests is a bad thing. If you can break your API request down into smaller sub-requests, the API can handle that a lot quicker than if you requested the same amount of data in one request. So what I mean by that, if let's say you want to get a lot of information about all the virtual guests on your account, you might do SoftLayer account get virtual guests and have an object mask that specifies all the list of properties that you want to get from virtual guests. And this can take a long time sometimes, depending on the properties you have and how many virtual guests you have. If this request is taking more than a few seconds, it can often be better to split that up. So, for example, you'd have SoftLayer account get virtual guests, but you'd only maybe get a few basic information about the virtual guests, like its ID, its host name, and a few other local properties from the virtual guest table. Then you have step 2. For every virtual guest that you got back, you'd call SoftLayer virtual guest get object with the full object mask that you wanted in the first spot. And I think you'll find that that performs a lot quicker than if you were just to do one request in and of itself. And so hopefully that gives you a good idea of how the API works on a basic level. So for more detailed information, we have a list of articles on SLDN that are highly worth reading. And each one goes into a specific topic about the API and how it works. And thank you very much for listening.